Can everyone hear me adequately? Those of you not checking email. Busted. So thank you, Phil. Thank you to the organizing committee for allowing me to come and give you this talk. We're going to take a little different angle. I work for the National Fisheries Service, as Phil said. I'm not going to emphasize the multi-sector with a constrained geography. I'm going to give you one sector across the whole broad geography. And we'll give you a little different perspective, but from the U.S. national angle of what we're doing with respect to the ecosystem approach, and maybe give you some of the thinking behind our science and where we're heading as we move forward. We've kind of covered this. I don't want to repeat this. As Jim was saying, I was very tempted to rewrite my talk, but I enjoyed lunch instead. And the thing to reinforce, starting with the first talk we saw this morning, is there's a lot of reasons why we're doing ecosystem-based management, ecosystem-based fisheries management. By the way, there's a great webpage called youthinkyourjobsucks.com, and that's a lot of good material there. But the point of that is we are so focused sometimes as in the natural sciences, and even more so now in some of the economic and other human sciences, social sciences, getting this element of precision. But with all the global changes that we have facing us, we could be very precise but very wrong and very off, and we could miss the target and hit this poor guy. There's a lot of other benefits. We've talked about them. Dealing with the trade-offs, dealing with cumulative effects, forcing us to sit down and think about that. That's all from the negative side. I also think from a systematic view, we actually have benefits that we can accrue, and I don't want to overlook that. So anyways, just preaching largely to the choir, there's a reason why we're doing this. A lot of it comes with this term called linguistic uncertainty, and you can see all the terms up there. For the purposes today, my understanding of the Arctic Council has adopted ecosystem approach, and I use that synonymously with ecosystem-based management. We can get into all that. Hein Rune, I'm sure, would be glad to waste all your evening over cocktails. I don't want to do that myself, just teasing him. But what I'd rather say is, where are we working? And we published a little paper on this, I think it was last year, to give you a sense of how we're thinking. I don't care what the terminology is. I care that when we're talking amongst ourselves, we're speaking at the same level. Let me unpack this for you real quickly. The bottom row talks about single species. So again, this is just from a fisheries sector perspective. We've had historically looked at stock assessments. We've done all of our angles, the science, the reference points, all the research, the management advice. We come out and we manage them stock by stock, and we heard some examples of that in Iceland a moment ago. We deliver that, at least in the U.S. context, on the right there in these fishery management plans. There's a wavy line above that. That distinction is purposely wavy and not hard. We're trying to now do an ecosystem approach to fisheries management where we're still focused on the stock, but we're explicitly looking at things like climate or ecological interactions or habitat or what have you. Certainly those things are in the stock level, but they're implied through some of the parameter terms. There's a wavy line above that, and this is where we're making a lot of hay, and I'll mention some of the details here in a moment. Ecosystem-based fishery management, where we're looking now at multiple stocks, and the talk we just heard from Canada is getting at some of this, and a lot of the talks we've heard as well. But in addition to multi-species, we're actually looking at a system of species, a system of fleets. We're looking at a whole range of other factors that you see there, climate, what have you. And the distinction is the bottom two rows are delivering this information and the management advice that's being implemented through fishery management plans, largely in the U.S. context in our Federal Fishery Management Council system. The third level there, ecosystem-based fishery management, we're trying to set that up and deliver that through our fishery ecosystem plans. So a little distinction, little difference there. Then what people often say, and I think is germane to the context today in the Arctic Council, is ecosystem-based management, and that is all things to all people, where we're dealing with the multiple ocean use sectors, whatever term you want to call it, but we're trying to tackle everything all at once. The challenge that you're wrestling with, the challenge that I see in the U.S. and several other jurisdictions, is once you get above that sectoral level, what the authorities are, what the venues and the governance structures are to deal with the trade-offs exist, but they're not always clear, and certainly the authorities and mandates aren't always clear. And I'll unpack that for you in a moment. But that's something that we're developing and is ongoing, I see in the U.S., and I see it, frankly, globally occurring right now. The Australians, again, we just heard the Canadians, and there's a couple other instances where we have these regional ocean plans. And our job is then to take all this and make those plans as actionable as possible. The key thing with this, whether you're calling it EA or EBM or whatever E's you like, I don't care. Just make sure if we're talking EBM and we're emphasizing multiple sectors, we're not having that same discussion with a fisherman who's worried about what's eating his fish. It's just that clarity of discussion helps with the linguistic certainty. Have I unpacked this enough, or do you want me to keep going? I'll just keep going. The other thing is we have multiple mandates. Probably every country does. And because there's multiple mandates, it means we have multiple objectives, and I view that as multiple opportunities. The arrow you see there is the typical arrow of resource management. You have to go out and measure stuff, get observations, collect data. You do a bunch of research, and you model it, and you do process studies and all this. You try to then synthesize that and come up with an assessment. And if from that assessment, you provide management advice. If you're above BMSY or below BMSY or FMSY or whatever you like, that's good or that's bad, take action. And you saw that with the harvest control rules. Our point in the U.S. context is we have over 450 fish species, over 200 marine mammal and protected species, over 2,000 habitat action and consultations. And in fact, I've been corrected. It's actually 4,000. I talked to our habitat folks 2 weeks ago. We have over 200 aquaculture actions and over 100 NEPA, National Environmental Policy actions, as well as 12, I forgot one in Antarctic, 12 large marine ecosystems we are responsible for in NOAA. And when I look at all that and I try to just keep tabs of all of that, I say, geez, maybe could we do something once and plug it in, maybe here, or wherever we plug it in, but could we do that thing once and then use it across all these mandates? You think that'd be a little more efficient? So they hired me, and here we are. And the point is, I think there's opportunities to do that. And I just want to emphasize, wherever it's appropriate to incorporate these ecosystem considerations. We had the discussion a moment ago about using this in a fisheries management context, how that affects quotas. Wherever it comes into play, I don't care. Just make sure that we're accounting for it and taking it into consideration. Again, my emphasis is in the U.S. fisheries context. Stepping back broadly, there are over 100 mandates, or nearly, I think there's 96 laws, executive orders, treaties, etc., in the U.S. that deal with ecosystem-based management of the ocean. About half of those 50, I think it's 49, deal with living marine resources. And in every one of those, there's some kind of an ecosystem requirement. And in my view, we need to do an ecosystem approach to address all these mandates simultaneously, let alone all the things just within them. Again, it harkens back to that efficiency across all the different things we're trying to do. And again, for terminology and clarification, when I say mandates that we unpack in the U.S., I think in the context of the Arctic Council, I'm loosely referring to ecological objectives, just to orient you to some of the thinking that's in the room today. There's a large international context for EA or EBM. I won't list this. Again, Hein Runa showed you some of these examples earlier this morning. The point is that there is no shortage of context, there's no shortage of background, there's no shortage of things saying it's a good idea to do EBM, and in fact, we're probably required to at one level or another. And again, I ran out of space, but you get the idea. It goes on and on. With respect to the Arctic policies, I anticipated every talk I saw this morning, so I just made this slide. Each of the member states are dealing with this in one level or another. As an example, in the U.S., there's an Arctic FMP in the fishery sector, in the EEZ for the U.S. There's a national ocean policy. We just heard about Canada's ocean policy. We're going to hear about the EU and their Marine Strategy Framework Directive, the Good Environmental Status, EcoQOs, etc. We'll hear about that in a moment or two. And I think the Arctic Council, as we saw repeatedly this morning, has explicitly adopted EAM. So I think there's a policy footing and setting here that says, yeah, let's do this, let's keep moving forward. But oftentimes we run into this challenge, yeah, but I don't know how to do this, it takes too much information, and there's all these myths. And we wrote a little paper to bust these myths, thinking that you can't do it if you don't have the terminology. Well, we kind of disagree. That's why we wrote or made that little diagram. There's no clear mandate to do this. Well, if you look internationally at all the things I showed you, going back to the Brundtland report and all the things beyond that, there's a pretty clear mandate, and certainly in the U.S. Across those 50 and then 96 sectors, mandates for EBFM and EBM. It's pretty clear. The other thing that I often run into is EBFM requires extensive data and complicated models. Yes, it requires information, but you go with what you've got. A lot of the thinking is we have to understand every mechanism about every process, about everything in the system, and that's wonderful scientifically. I'm all for that, but in terms of management, we need to step back from that. There's a different angle there. And then EBM or EBFM is a naive attempt to describe a complex system. We understand that. We run into that challenge with simplification, use of indicators, and things of that ilk. The point there is that we need to simplify things so that it's useful enough to make informed choices to manage the risks that we're facing. And we can do that. We do that all the time. No one here knows how to, very few people here probably know how to, am I allowed to invoke carburetors and things of that ilk? Most people probably couldn't fix your own car or change a spark plug, but it doesn't stop you from hopping in your car and driving. Or if you're in Europe, riding a bus or whatever. So the point is, we understand it's a complex system in the biophysical element. It's even worse when you add in the human element. That just adds to the complexity. And then when you throw in the governance charts, and you've seen more diagrams this morning than you probably care to. I'll show you another one in a second. The governance is equally complex, and the point is we can move forward with this. That's one of the things. If you take nothing away from what I say today, take that away, please. We can move forward with it. So what we're trying to do, remember the different levels. This is our next generation stock assessment, our stock assessment improvement, our protected resource stock assessment improvement plans. We're using that whole process. Remember, observations, research, models, integration, synthesis, assessment, management advice. We're using that arrow kind of here at the stock assessment level to deal with the stocks and the ecosystem approaches to those stocks, where we're bringing in other facets. And we're using the integrated ecosystem assessment process, which ultimately curls around to a loop, and Gru showed you that earlier. We'll show you the same graphic here in a second. But we're using that to inform the system level fishery sector and this broader ecosystem-based management sector. We're using that element of the EBM, of the IEAs to inform EBM. The key things here is basically you take that arrow that I showed you and you curl it around and you begin to get this adaptive management loop, whatever you call it. You saw the octopus that was broken and all that stuff earlier. The point is there are pretty clearly defined steps, and these map to where we're going in the U.S. with our EBFM policy, and I think these map pretty similarly to what I'm seeing the 6 main steps in the Arctic Council's elements. But we're viewing this as an analytical framework to actually implement IEAs. And part of the linguistic uncertainty is what is the end game? Is the end game an IEA? Is the end game an assessment? Is the end game management? And my thinking, a lot of our thinking has kind of morphed into this. We're trying to do EBM or EAM. We're using IEAs to get there. So hopefully that's a helpful clarification. Somebody will probably counteract that in a talk or two, which is fine. Let's have that discussion. But the key thing from all of this, are there common ecological objectives? Are there common mandates? At the highest levels of national policy, yeah. And we see this internationally as well as in the member states. There's things like prevent overfishing, protect biodiversity, reduce pollutants, et cetera, et cetera. We need to maintain those. But those higher level policies, those mandates, need to be unpacked to provide quantitatively specific control rules. So how do we get them? And this is the rub of what I'm trying to get at today. And I'll show you how we're aiming to do that and planning to do that, and are starting to do that in the U.S. in this EBFM context for the fisheries sector. So we developed an ecosystem-based fishery management policy statement, and we wanted to clarify the National Marine Fisheries Service to this end. We wanted to establish a set of guiding principles and accelerate the implementation of doing this because we believe there are a lot of benefits. And the key issues really are, how do you do that under existing authorities, and how do you identify a systematic approach? So we did this. My boss said, I want you to develop an ecosystem-based roadmap so we know how to do this. I said, yes, sir. And he said, make sure it's consistent with our ecosystem-based fishery management policy. I said, yes, sir. And then we stared at each other for about 30 seconds, and then I said, what policy? So that was a 6-month detour. But anyways, we got the policy statement done. We released that in May. You can copy it here. If this is not up here long enough, just catch me at a break or whatever, and we'll get you the URL for that. But the guiding principles are very simple. Everybody has them. You start looking at the terminology. As Jim was saying, a lot of this general sense is starting to congeal and coalesce. We started with the end in mind. We want to maintain resilient ecosystems. We want to have that as our outcome. And to do that, we need to give wise advice that incorporates this ecosystem information. Well, what are our options to do that? And this is where a lot of our trade-off evaluations, our management strategy evaluations, our modeling is occurring. Well, what are our priorities? Well, we're going through a whole set of risk analyses that you don't need a whole lot of information for to triage the things that are highest at risk or most sensitive. Well, what's the foundational science we need to do that? Well, there's some infrastructural things, but just exploring and highlighting these things in an ecosystem context that we know are important. And the key thing, and particularly germane for this discussion, is what are our objectives? And we want to implement ecosystem level planning. That to us is something where the human dimension element is absolutely critical. It's absolutely something we refuse to do without having the social scientists involved. And we don't want to do that, even though we could probably get a sense of this, we don't want to do that without a clear understanding, certainly of the legal mandates, but also of the specific unpacked objectives in a given region, taking on board local ecological knowledge, local needs, et cetera, et cetera. So this is our scoping, this is our outreach, this is our stakeholder engagement that we think is absolutely critical and underpins all the other stuff up to meet that endpoint. Is there an economist in the room? I want you to clap, because I didn't know she used to say that. So never mind. Wrapping up shortly, 6 guiding principles. We have core components. We took that pyramid. It's the same pyramid. We turned it around. The first one is this planning. That's engagement strategy. There's fishery ecosystem plans. We have these core components. We unpack them. We now have I think on the order of 42 or 45 action items that relate to these core components. Not 45 per each, but in total, different action items. Again, this is not dissimilar to the things you've already seen in many other contexts. And we're trying to develop specific things. What is it that we can do here? What is it that we can do here that we can measure our success or our slowness, whatever you want to call it, over time to see, are we actually doing this and moving forward with ecosystem-based fishery management. So if you fixate on these 6 principles, you flip them upside down and look at them, and you kind of walk down here, and you look then at the Arctic ecosystem approach, I hope you'll see, I certainly saw, Phil pointed this out to me, there's a lot of similarities. And that's what I want you to understand, is that we're moving towards the same thing. We might have a little different terminology, we might have a little different ways we approach what we call it, but we're really pushing towards the same end of managing these human activities for sustainability, wise use, whatever phrase you like. But that underpinning and that element up here is quite similar across our IEA approach that's embedded in our ecosystem-based fishery management roadmap that's pretty consistent of all the things that I saw this morning. So I'm heightened and encouraged by the heightened level of congealing and coalescence of the discipline in different geographies. Here are the lessons learned. We want to have some consistency but flexibility. If you can do that, it's kind of like everybody on the same yoga mat. Never mind. Climate and human dimensions are critical. I kind of emphasize that. I didn't emphasize the climate so much, but we often jump right in and we're measuring fish or oil or zooplankton even, but the whole shebang is really critical. And then again, integration is challenging, but it's something we can do, but you have to integrate across programs, themes, sectors, disciplines, what have you. I think the other thing that we're seeing both in a national and certainly this international context is just a forum to get people together to talk and develop and build partnerships that we've heard already is key. And this can-do attitude is also pretty critical in the sense of not that we're Pollyannish, not that we're missing the challenges, but we don't have an option. We've got to find solutions for the challenges facing us. So we're going to keep doing what we can to try and find what those are and make them work. Our roadmap is out on this webpage. It's open for public comment until, I believe, October 15th. If you want to take a look at it and send us comments, you're more than welcome to do so. If you want to make sure that we're harmonizing with your efforts, you're welcome to do so. If you want to send a comment saying that you think this is a great idea, I would appreciate that too. But more so, if there's something you want to debate or you think we missed, sincerely I welcome that. With that, let me pass it back to you, Phil, for questions, and then we can move on. So thank you.
Thanks, Jason.